Magic is found in every room where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah, and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset, and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance. Hey, welcome to Magic in the Room. I am Luke Freeman.
I'm Hannah Broderud.
And I'm Chris Providence. Thank you guys for joining us today. Good morning, Hannah. Good morning, Luke. How are you?
Doing great.
Doing well.
Excited.
Awesome. Good to see you. Yeah. Good to see you guys. Great to kick off really a new year here. Lots of stuff to look forward to. As I think back to 2020, it was one of those days that year. So we're after, and that kind of fuels my question for today. After so many months of being confined, travel's been limited, like freedom of movement has been constricted. And what are you guys looking forward to? Like when we're not constrained on our movement or our travel or the things that we do, what are you looking forward to? What's the first thing you're going to kind of break out and go make happen?
Oh, that's a great question. And seeing as we are all here back in our home offices, as we've been, travel restrained and restricted. I think for me, first thing is I'm going to go back to Norway and spend some time with my family, because that was a trip that I regrettably had to, I was able to make one of the planned trips last year at a different time, but I was grateful to be able to go and see my parents once. But yeah, my mom turned 70 last year and we were supposed to have a big family gathering. So I want to make sure we can make that happen early in the year, as early as travel is allowed and possible. And then I want to go find a beach somewhere that's open and just have some warmth and sunshine in my life. So those are two trips I want to try to make happen as soon as I can.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so I'm going to take the totally non-fun approach. I mean, I do want to go to the mountains at some point and get my kids outside and have an adventure for sure. But, honestly, I really miss the feeling of walking into a client's office, like in their space for the first time, and get the feel that it allows you to get for their culture and who they are and their personality. And, we've connected with a lot of, new clients virtually, and those virtual meetings is just really interesting because it's a little bit like vanilla. You're in the same space that you're always in, the same background that I always have. And, sometimes people are camera on, sometimes they're camera off, and, you're totally just going based on like, how was this one conversation? And you're not able to ask about, well, hey, what's this over here? Tell me about that. And even get a sense for how other folks that you pass in the hall, do they look at you and smile? Do they say hello, or are they heads down and, just doing their daily grind? So I don't know. The adventure, the sense of adventure of doing that, the sense of discovery, the opportunity to connect with people and help them, I miss that.
Yeah, agreed. I think that will be a wonderful part of no longer being constrained. Is just being able to connect differently. And I have some thoughts around how that plays out that I don't want to get to later, but I'm excited to, like be somewhere with like the kids as they've grown up, like we've really went a whole year without having those shared experiences, outside of our space. And it's been awesome, like learning how to ride bikes and scooters and, all of that, but those just, adventure, and having something like that. But with, what will be a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and both of them being girls, like Disneyland has to be in our future. We are suckers for everything related to Disney, and to consume that product the way we do and not be able to experience it, in the way that I'm familiar with is um, I don't know, we're missing that sense of adventure and all the Mickey Mouse things. So looking forward to getting to Disney, and uh, yeah, a lot of business implications for them. I want to talk about just a little bit later, but that's something every day I think I wake up and go, man, I wish I woke up at Disneyland today. So like the girls are ready, I'm ready, um, but looking forward to that. But well, the reality of the situation, we're not quite to that, pace of play. I guess we're still kind of entering 2021 as vaccines start to be dispersed and the business conditions are still non-traditional. Um, but today we're really talking about this vision for 2021, and what can it be, and what what are the organizational approaches, what are our leadership mindsets that really can carry us through. And Luke, I think there's some interesting conversation around the dispersion that's happened in 2020, and I think that's probably the crux of most of our considerations as we look into 2021. So maybe walk us through a bit of how you've seen that organizational landscape play out and kind of that system change. And then I'd love to talk more about how that affects personal responsibility and the effect on talent and, our, I don't know, our degrees of ownership maybe. But give us a breakdown of how you've seen the organizational landscape change between 20 and 21.
Yeah, and I think it really will be a longer conversation than just 2020 and 2021. I think for the most part, most folks listening probably are in the same boat as we are, where we know that the amount of change, the amount of learning, the amount of adaptation that people really have, at least folks who have embraced the change and had to get really creative, have kind of hammered out of the rough steel of this last year. We know that there's going to be a lot of lasting change. And when I think back to like just in my lifetime and my measured short time on this planet, like really I think about the digital age, the information age, kind of the emergence of that, which to me became popularized in the late 90s as I remember logging on to like, what is Google, right? Logging on to that for the first time. Like you really can search for anything. Oh, let's come up with the craziest thing we can think of and type it into this search engine. And oh my gosh, someone has a website about that, right? That was a life-changing day. And, over the years that emerged, late 90s, early aughts, it really has taken us a long time to start to see what the outcomes of that wide social adoption of that tool and the way that we interact with information as a people, right, has really now started to materialize just in the last couple of years with, public hearings on Capitol Hill with Facebook, Twitter, CEOs. And we don't know exactly where that's going to go yet. But I think when we apply that same thinking to 2020, 2021, the things that we have learned, the things that have changed, the amount of people who are working differently and have had to adopt kind of the remote way of life, have had to adopt the tools at their fingertips, organizations having to adopt these tools. My guess is it's going to take us 10 years to really see how that changes what it means to work as a professional in the United States. And, we could make some predictions about that. But I do think that one of the large shifts, like you said, Chris, is around like mindset and ownership of my career and my work life. And moving from a place of entitlement and really having high expectation for what the organization provides to a space where I really know that it's on my shoulders to figure out what my monitor setup is and what room I'm going to be working in and who's going to make coffee for today. It's going to be me, you know. That maybe that can be the theme song. It's going to be me. Is that Backstreet Boys?
I think it's insane.
For the
Yeah.
next decade, you know. So, oh man, let's not hear that daily for the next decade. But
Yeah.
anyway, just this idea that, you know, sure, someone might give me a stipend. Someone might ship me a laptop and a couple monitors and a standing desk or whatever. But who's going to set that up? Like, I'm going to set it up. I'm going to load the software. I'm going to figure things out. And what that means is that if I and, you know, several million other people are doing that and learning how to do that, like the organization and the importance of the organization and what they provide in the daily life of people does change in some way. And we probably do shift to some sort of, you know, empowered network and a dispersed network rather than depending on hierarchical institutions to the degree that we have for the last, you know, 50 years, 70 years.
Yeah, and I know Hannah, like we've both spent time in telecom and this idea of network, right? Like how the networks are set up that we operate in effectively what Luke's describing is like we're going from this hierarchical, you know, here's my supervisor and here's his supervisor and all that industrialism chain of command sort of environment, and which is it's kind of linear, right? And I can see, you know, who's supposed to be responsible for me, and but now we're like node to node. Like I connect with some of my teammates this day and this client that day, and it's not always with all of my team around me. It's very much like, you know, normally we'd be sharing an office, connecting with multiple clients and collaborating, gathering around the water cooler. Like, what does this dispersion mean to you, Hannah? And like, how do you perceive this kind of network change of how we work?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating analogy, and I've always been interested in the analogies of, you know, networks to human networks as we look at, you know, electronic, digital, fiber networks, which is a little bit of our DNA and where we came from. You know, you can look at a network map, and there's different topologies where you have, you know, some of the traditional topologies would be this hub and spoke type of thing where you have kind of this hub, your headquarter, and you have all the spokes coming off of it, connecting directly into the headquarter. You can have also, well, the simplest form of a network is literally just two nodes with one line between them, right? That's what creates a network, is that line, not the nodes, but the line between them is when we have a network. And that's a point to point, right? And that's the simplest form of a network. So any human relationship, any conversation, any person to person relationship, which would be that type of, you know, point to point, A to B kind of network. And then you add more people in, right? And then you can have different configurations. And I think what's happening in this dispersed work environment, and granted, some organizations have already operated on a partially meshed kind of network where they've had partially dispersed workforces. But I think that has accelerated, and we've been forced into greater levels of disbursement, where now we're looking at more and more organizations really becoming this like fully meshed kind of network topology where it's any to any connectivity at any time. And, you know, that's really fascinating. And it has also implications for culture, for example, in an organization. It also has on a global scale, you know, Luke, you mentioned earlier how we won't really know how work will have changed in the United States until 10 years from now. And in some ways, as you know, the world has moved towards more globalization. I think this pandemic, because it was a global event, it has become an equalizer in some sense, because we're truly now all in the same boat, where this type of change is happening all over the world at the same time, at a pretty rapid speed, right? So we're becoming fully meshed, not just within our own work cultures, but also globally as location becomes less important. People could potentially work from anywhere. And that also erases some borders, right? Physical borders of a physical building, borders within, like city location and having be co-located in the same place. Not, and it erases even national country borders, right? You can be employed by a company that's registered in one country and you can live in another. And not, again, not that that hasn't existed in some form before, but now that is becoming more of the way and the trend of the future.
Yeah, right. As you said, the globalization piece. I was writing that literally as you said it, and I saw Luke kind of had an aha look on his face. It is, you do break down those borders, and as you guys spoke through that, I really think a trend is going to be around hiring. Because when you have this node sort of network and all these interconnections, people work. We're going to be working a lot more in one-on-one environments, or if I'm a project manager, I'm leading teams independently without that inner office collaboration, the day-to-day, the here's how things are going. And so there's a little bit of loss of organizational control over what's really happening in that day-to-day business function, which then I think puts a lot more pressure on the character of the people that we're hiring, and making certain that you have the proper traits within the people to execute your business model. So, if you are really independent, you do high level complex work, you're going to have high levels of conscientiousness and grit in the people that you hire. And so what is that, um, you know, what is that model for every organization? How do they figure that out? And ultimately hire the people with appropriate character to fulfill the needs of that business. And I don't think it's one answer. I think every organization has their own archetypes for their job roles. But we talked about this on our staff call a bit this week. Think about how world-class organizations that compete at a world-class level. Think about NFL, MLB, like a lot of sports organizations or professional sports organizations. How long and how much rigor do they use in making their hiring decisions to then only be right 55% of the time? And then you think about, like, if some organizations defer hiring like down to line level management, and the people that we hire, every person is a potential director or CEO or COO or whatever, a potential future leader of that company. And one of the things I hope this creates is more focus and more intentionality around determining the right archetypes for the needs of our businesses. But this idea that somehow, some way, I could be working for a company in Denmark next year. I mean, does it really matter if it's out of San Francisco, Tulsa, New York City, or Denmark, or Norway, or Germany? Or it starts to break down a lot of those walls now, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. So, I've got a question for you guys, but you guys' thoughts on hiring and the pressures on that as we go into 2021?
A couple things. One, the huge opportunity with that is if an organization gets clarity on its archetype, like the values of the people that it needs on its team to be successful, then, and I, as an individual, get clarity on my values, right? I should be able to find a really good fit. I shouldn't be constrained by the city that I live in. I shouldn't be constrained by my personal network as much, although we know that's a huge factor in people getting placed. I should be able to depend on, like, the more I get clarity about who I am and what I believe and the way that I do work, the more clarity I should have on who I'm a perfect fit for, and the more clarity they should have on how great of a fit I would be for them. And so that's kind of on the positive side. But I do want to say, a little bit of reality that I want to add in here is that like progressive, well-meaning organizations, I think, yes, are going to go down that path. But the other side is that we're probably going to move from manager led evaluation, performance management, which are already antiquated processes, right? The idea that I do a quarterly or annual evaluation and my supervisor gets to choose how well I did and what my career opportunities are. Like, that's already a bad idea. And all the research shows how bad an idea that is. But the fact that I only see them on Zoom a couple times a week now, right? Or maybe even once a day for half an hour or an hour if we work really closely together. Like, the threads are going to really start showing really quickly on those old processes. But I think organizations that maybe are less well intended are going to lean on all the data that we now are going to have at our fingertips to make those decisions. So login time, outputs, like all these things that can be measured. And for a lot of folks, that opportunity of meritocracy is going to be really empowering. And that's a really good thing. On the other side, some folks are going to learn to game that system, if that truly is the system. Probably not really very differently than how people game the supervisor centric system that we have now, right? So schmoozing your supervisor, we all know folks that have gotten ahead by doing that, right? Like, and not that that will stop, but there's going to be new versions of that where I schmooze the data that I know is being captured about me. And that's how I get ahead. So we're going to have to be thinking about, all of these things as we move forward. Now, is all of that going to emerge in 2021? No, but I think we're going to see some early adopters start to really struggle with some of those things.
Yeah, as you say that, and Hannah, I want to get your thoughts on this too. But as you say that, in that focus on like when you log in, what are your outputs, da 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 da, like very digitized metrics. I think there's a key point of differentiation could be like how do you show up when you are physically present, right? And how much like that's going to be limited time now. So how good do I have to be in that moment? Now, for me, I can't wait for that moment, right? And I'm going to be looking for ways to make that happen. But if you're not a person that's wired to do that, I think you're going to be at a real disadvantage. If you're the person that wants to stay behind the camera, set in your home office on Zoom, etc., I think that is now a discount because we have to connect as humans too. And so when you speak to those more digital metrics, Luke, I immediately think, well, where does the human side of this come into play? And how do we differentiate ourselves through connection still? So Hannah, your thoughts on, I don't know, performance management, hiring, how we show up as humans in this world. Where's your head at right now?
Yeah, so kind of the collective term for all of that, I think of culture, right? And what kind of culture we create in our organizations. There's always a culture, whether we're intentional about it or not. And when we have less direct control of the work environment, we have to be very intentional about how we build culture and how we foster culture. And back to kind of this theme we started, looking at earlier of personal responsibility of how do I show up? What is my part in this? How do I own the tone that I set for the team, the way in which I bring the team together and pull people together and create an intentional culture. How do I, as an individual, show up and influence that? Because when we're all meeting on a Zoom call or in some kind of remote environment, we know that there's a certain energy in a room, right? There's a reason this podcast is called Magic in the Room. There's a different level of magic when we're physically together face to face in a room. We can recreate that when we have the power of video. We have at least some more information. I think, for one thing, just as an aside, I think the great thing about this shift is that organizations are finally moving away from the dreaded conference calls, like multiple people conference calls where you're just like listening and you're trying to pay attention to what's going on, and it's really hard, right? When you have this sort of move towards everybody has camera on and you can see each other, it creates a more intentional way of having a meeting, right? And we have a lot more information because we can pick up on those nonverbal clues. But that also means it takes a little more effort, right, in a different way to show up. How do you transmit energy through a screen, right? And as a former, I've had a lot of roles in my life, telemarketing and inside sales, where I did a lot of, I had to transmit a lot of energy through my voice alone, right? And it takes some intentionality, but the energy that you bring to the table and to the virtual room has an impact on the culture that you create and the kind of experience that others have. And yes, we can pick up on that in a room. We also can pick up on that in a virtual room, right? And it takes more effort to show up that way. And so I think, there's this brain fatigue that comes with that, right? But it's incumbent on each individual to be aware of those dynamics and take ownership of, what kind of environment am I creating when we're all together?
Yeah. And so something that, again, it's a version of intentionality, right? But it's something I hit on just recently, maybe a month or so ago. It said, try over preparing, then see what happens. And whether it's relative to our podcast, Luke and I did a strategic planning session yesterday that I felt like, compared to our typical amount of preparation, it was extreme or over prepared. But then you see the result of that over preparedness. And I think it can apply to when we do strategic planning, before we meet on podcast, how we approach assessment with client partners, et cetera. It's this idea of ratcheting up, like wherever you are today, when you think about over preparing, then see what happens. In like nothing happens but good things, because you just start at such a more advanced position. And I think it's a route to efficiency. Luke, thoughts on over preparedness?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to this idea that, entitlement is dead.
Yeah.
And that's not true. I don't 100% believe that, but I'm going to say it just to be
tell me
a little bit provocative. But
that was my question. My question was, tell me why that's true. Tell me why do I need to take more responsibility? Why is it on me? Like, I signed up with this organization and this leader and this career. Like, why is it true, any more true now than what it has been?
Yeah, I think, like, to go back to what Hannah was talking about with networks, like as those systems get broken down, like depending on the hierarchy, depending on the physical office space, like one of two things is going to happen as we take those structures away and they continue to dissolve. Either emergence can happen, and you guys know like that I love just the concept of emergence and am a fan there, but it's the idea that order, or the next level of being, the next level of evolution for an organization can emerge out of a network, a system, right? And so as we get rid of those, what would have been constraints, systemic constraints of physical structure, ways of being, whatever, emergence can happen. And as new ways of being emerge, those who take responsibility for how they're going to show up and how they're going to shape what emerges are going to find opportunity. They're going to be a step ahead of others. The other thing that can happen is entropy, right? Which is the opposite of emergence. If emergence is new ways of organization happening, right? Entropy is the dissolving of organization towards chaos. I mean, in 2020, like we saw a lot of things in a state of entropy. I mean, I think about like the state of our political system, and this isn't just 2020, right? This has been going on for a while, but it's in a state of entropy. Like the things that worked and the systems that were in place that maybe they didn't always work, right? You could argue if they worked or if they worked for everyone or whatever, but they at least provided some stability and some level of expectation. They are in a state of entropy that has not stopped, right? I think that's a big question for 2021 is that entropy going to continue or will it stabilize and us get some clarity on new ways of being that are stabilized, right? So that can happen in other systems and work systems as well. And there are going to be organizations that were pushed into a state of entropy, that their systems are dissolving, their ways of being are dissolving, and they don't recover. It's going to descend into chaos, and they're going to file for bankruptcy or dissolution or whatever happens. And in those settings as well, the people who take personal responsibility and understand that they are primarily responsible for their own success, their own career, are going to be the ones that take courageous action first to eject themselves from those entropic organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of recreate that constant recreation of order and, submitting to disciplines to create mastery and like that's the idea. And I if you're a leader, like this is the time you've been waiting for, because I think we can get a lot of the noise, a lot of the bullshit out of the system and the meritocracy component. Like I've always, why I like gaming is like there's a heavy element of meritocracy to leading in that environment. Like it's very much a world where you get it done or you don't get it done. Any reason for it not to be done is just some version of an excuse. And like I love the meritocracy play of that. And we can debate for days other elements of the industry, but I love the idea that sense can come across to us as leaders within our organizations, within our business. And it really becomes about what are the outcomes that we can produce as leaders. I'm not speaking to leader as a sense of hierarchical position. I'm talking about leader of ourselves, of our environments, getting our beliefs forward. And it, tying everything back to purpose, I think it was Nietzsche that said, anyone with a why can suffer anyhow, right? And that's kind of what we're going through. If we can anchor back to our purpose, like every year is full of opportunity, and we see it as like being able to tap the power of human positive potential. And I've talked about it before. Like we don't know. We don't know how good this year can be. Anchor back to our why. We put our beliefs forward and see what we can tap. See what's there for us to experience. See how how do we want to shape our environments? How do we want to pull our beliefs forward? And that's, we didn't get here without challenge, and there will be more challenges to come. Like decisions that are made today lead to tomorrow's consequence, and there's no good or bad consequence. It's just not. We don't know ultimately is COVID-19, is it good or bad? I mean, now we're getting short-term consequence. It has to be bad, right? But we can't argue that there's been a lot of good things come from it, right? So that's the idea. It's keeping the mindset to deal with consequence. And so one of the consequences I want to talk about is, right now we're all restricted, and I'm in this place that's highly scheduled every day, 8 o'clock Zoom, 9 o'clock Zoom, 10 o'clock Zoom, 3-hour strat planning call, followed by a 30-minute 5:30 Zoom. And it's wild, right? And it feels a lot more scheduled than any sort of office environment that I've ever been in. And like when we lack on-site time, we have to schedule, we still have the work to do. So we still need the collaboration time, but now it's scheduled like throughout a month. So we don't have to sit on Zoom for 8 hours at a time. Right. And so it's very difficult. And so I want to pick your guys' brains on like the idea of self-care, rejuvenation, and like, does that become more of a topic, or maybe it's a topic that has always just kind of been there? I know like we talk about it a lot, but does that get elevated this year as we are confined to whatever our workspaces are and are leading a more scheduled existence?
So I think it goes back to that idea of ownership and intentionality, right? Yes, self-care has always been important. And now that the system has changed in which we operate, we have to change our approach to that. We have to own that. We have to make sure. So if we live in a more highly scheduled, and I, like I was in corporate world where I actually had my days were exactly the way you described, Chris, where I was on Skype calls and internal meetings almost every hour of the day, and meetings would just be placed on my calendar, and I had very little control over my calendar. And you just get invited to meetings and you show up because you're supposed to be there, and you find yourself in this like, unless you're intentional about blocking out time for the other things that matter, which are white space, time to think. When you operate in a function of thought leadership, right? Where do you have the thinking space, and how do you create that space and that margin in your day? Where does that happen? How do you take care of, your physical body? And when we're operating from a work from home, mostly online all the time kind of environment, it's easy to just sit in front of a computer for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And that is the best way to break down your body, right? And shorten your life. So how do you build in time for physical movement? How do you build in the right level of the mix of, sleep and rest with physical movement, and be intentional about that self-care? And again, like we each have to own that, and we have to, it goes back to prioritizing. What do I need? You mentioned the word rejuvenation, right? So we've talked about that on this podcast before, of generating energy, and not just recovering after a big push, but re-energizing and rejuvenating. And how can we be intentional about building that into our days?
Yeah, it kind of ties back to that concept of entropy versus emergence, like on all fronts, right? If we're not doing one, we're doing the other. And so I think it's really something to be aware of as we work through 21 in this newly designed system. And that's what I'll take away from you, Hannah, is say it's always been important, but the system has changed. So how we approach it also needs to change. Now's the time to get really intentional about those outcomes that you want, so we can set those boundaries, so we can make that part of our routine, so we can have the white space, get the right sleep, get the right movement, and execute as leaders within whatever our chosen professions may be.
Before we move on from that, just wanted to pull thread a little bit more on this, entropy idea versus, Luke, you talked about systems that are in a state of entropy, and will that continue, or will that stabilize? And I do think there are systems that are going to fall to the wayside, that are no longer relevant, right? But what we've also seen in 2020, which I think will continue to accelerate in 21 and beyond, is the innovation that comes from that, right? So when the system is no longer working and the ways of working are no longer relevant or efficient, we have to come up with new ways. And so being open to innovate and to pivot and to change our approach and try new things, I think is a theme that will, as the pace of change accelerates, the pace of innovation has to accelerate too. And I keep going back to one of my favorite quotes by Eric Hoffer, who is, who said, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." And I feel like that is more true today than ever before, right? It's always been true, but so from an organizational perspective, being a learning organization, from an individual perspective, being someone who is motivated by learning and embracing change in terms of what is it that we're learning. And that kind of brings us into, the mindset piece, right? Having that growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. If you have a fixed mindset, you were in a world of trouble in 2020, right? And you may not recover in 21 at all.
I think the blessing in disguise is threats to those things at the bottom of our Maslow's hierarchy of needs, shelter, food, safety. And a lot of people felt those threats. And, there's a lot of suffering that comes along with that. And I don't want to minimize that. I think we want to care for people well. And I've seen a lot of generosity this year in taking care of folks, that those basic human needs have been threatened. But the other side, the opportunity that comes with it, is that if we're not typically adopters of a growth mindset, and those items at the very bottom of our needs pyramid are threatened, like, it does force us to think differently and to have a little bit different mindset and to look at things in ways that we wouldn't typically look at them before. And I guess my hope in that is that I think most of us have found ourselves in that place in 2020 where we've been forced to think differently. And my hope is that if most of us have had that experience this year, that there's a good number of people that hopefully will keep that mindset moving forward. And I'm excited about what that means for the next 20, 30 years. There's a generation that, like, forced creativity, like, how much of that's going to stick, and how much innovation and new ways of being are going to emerge that would never have happened if 2020 hadn't happened. And we might not see the fruit of that for a decade or 2 decades, but I think there's going to be some pretty cool ideas that come out.
Yeah, and what I pick up on there, Luke, is this idea that 2020, like, it was energizing to us in physical ways because our bottom rung needs were challenged. So I'm physically energized to do the things necessary to fulfill, those needs. Well, what's crazy as we get into 2021, we've got to make this massive conversion from physical resilience to psychological resilience. And I think that's a big swing. In without the right mindset, we're going to be stuck. We're going to be the learned. In what I see play out is people looking at the situation, these refined systems, and saying, I didn't choose this world. This was thrust upon me. And that sense it builds resentment. And I believe that resentment is the number one performance constraint. When we have resentment, we start looking at situations to get revenge, to be vengeful, to ultimately create some level of chaos and mayhem. And I kind of view what the leader's journey through this year has been equivalent to kind of spelunking through a dark cave, reestablishing order as we navigate inch by inch to this place that we know nothing about. And that's the kind of this hero's journey or the leader's journey, like getting really close to your beliefs, getting really understanding of the operating systems that we built for ourselves, reestablishing those the way that we think we want them to look going forward. But then the fixed mindset approach is, I didn't pick this, so I'm going to work against this system. And what's going to happen is we're going to create a lot of suffering for ourselves if that's our mindset, and the people around us and our team. So as leaders, we have to start creating that dialogue for people on our teams that have that mindset. I didn't choose this, you didn't choose this, but guess what? We have to work through it together and bring them into the cave with us, where we, like, that cave is scary. Like, all the things, like, it's dark in there. We don't know what's in there. It is scary. All the things that scare us, we have to now navigate through. And while it's been the most difficult thing, that a lot of us have ever encountered, it has, I think, brought us a lot closer to self-realization. It's brought us deeper levels of understanding of what's important. And I think really sets leaders up with that growth mindset to move forward in a really successful way. But, something that I would say for the folks that, when we feel like I didn't choose this, and we find ourselves in those situations, I think getting above the situation and get about 30,000 feet and think about it. Like, it's not about where you're at relative to your neighbor. It's not about where I'm at relative to, other family members. Like, this is my journey. And what if I look at it from, what is my relative position to everyone on earth? Like, I'm sitting here, I've got one PC up and another PC with notes on it. And, the place is air conditioned or heated, and I've got a roof over my head. Like, that's pretty good spot compared to everyone on this planet. So it's all about relative position. So if we can get above that, for me, I think that helps put things into a little bit of perspective. It expands gratitude. So let's keep that frame of reference in mind, so we don't get overcome with resentment, and that we have the courage, like when we feel that feeling of resentment because of new situations, let's step forward and have the conversations that need to be had, or let go of whatever it is I need to let go of to relieve that suffering. So those are the only two things that can happen. Otherwise, I'm going to be vengeful and create chaos and mayhem. So I think managing that sentiment is really key as we work through these expanding, changing, constantly modified networks of existence. And it's exciting. It's an exciting time. But Luke, Hannah, your thoughts on, I don't know, resentment, mindset, anything else before we head out of here?
Well, I think just to tie it back to my earlier point of when the system has changed and the world that we knew that we had become experts at no longer exists, right? We can choose our mindset. We can get really resentful that I spent all this time learning how to operate effectively within the system, and now the system is broken, or it doesn't work, or it went away. And now I don't know what to do, and I'm mad about it, and I let that turn into resentment. Or I can acknowledge reality, recognize what the new reality is, learn the things that I need to learn to build a better system, and then learn how to operate in that system. But I think the mindset difference is, and it's kind of like any skill, right? Even, back to, let's talk about networks and systems in terms of, computer language. You become an expert at writing code in a particular language, and you're highly intelligent, and you're very efficient and proficient at it. And then things change, and it's no longer that language that things are written in. And so either you become the person that stays really niche and you become irrelevant, or you become the person that gets good at learning new languages, that gets good at learning new systems, that becomes nimble. And that kind of ties back to our previous episode of nimble learning, right? Are we nimble learners? And I think in change our mindset to choose to look at every change and as an opportunity to learn, we can let go of the resentment and dive into the adventure.
Yeah, exactly. Luke, your thoughts?
I think as we try and make that move, there are some helpful things to ask ourselves, as we move from entitlement to gratitude, essentially. That's what I hear you asking, Chris. And for me, a really helpful question for myself, and this comes from a good friend of mine, Chris King, is this idea of, am I entering this situation, viewing my circumstances primarily with the intent of being a consumer or being a contributor? And if I find myself in those places where, I just want to be a consumer here. That's my motivation. That's my intent. Like, give me this thing to fill my belly, to fill my attention, to make me feel good. Right. Then it's going to be really easy for me to start having those feelings of resentment that come with, entitlement. But if I can continue to ask myself, like, what can I do today to be a contributor, to contribute to the people around me, to contribute to the systems that I'm a part of, to contribute to ultimately the society and this planet that we're on. How do I contribute and make this a better place to be? That can really help guide those feelings and undercut that feeling of resentment that can start to rise when we start looking at our circumstances and saying, oh, well, I'm worse off than I was a year ago, or I'm worse off than I was 2 years ago. I have these challenges. How am I going to overcome them? How am I going to get back on track? Right? My pathway got pulled out from under me. Right? It's really tempting. But if my goal is to make the path better for me and everyone else who's on the path, right? Well, it's a little bit more okay that it twisted and went off course. We're all still here on this path. Like, how do I contribute to make it a better path and better experience for the folks that I'm on it with?
I love that. So great themes today. I mean, entropy versus emergence, contribution versus consumer, all great things to keep in mind as we, begin this journey into 2021. So what I hear is, let's be nimble, be learners, not learned. Let's be aware of how these systems are changing as we engage with them, and approach things with fresh eyes as we emerge from a period when we were really feeling around in the dark. And let's look at every situation, not to build pre-COVID solutions, but to build solutions with new eyes and a sense of awe as we experience the world in a lot of ways for the very first time. And I think that approach to 2021 will, I think it lessens suffering. It puts us all in a position to succeed. And I think that's more the approach of what highly successful leaders will take as we enter this new world. So just thank you guys today so much. Thanks for making me better. Thanks for the contribution, the collaboration, and I look forward so much to doing 2021 with both of you guys.